Correct.
What, according to you, is the difference between calling and career?
Every individual, every Christian believer need to ask, why has God placed her as a doctor in a hospital or someone else as a lawyer in a firm?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Reasons Podcast, wherein we explore the big questions of life, faith, and the Bible. I am your host, Balajit Nongrum. In today's podcast, we are going to look at the topic of engaging the Agora, Christian influence in the public square. It is a subject that calls us not only to think critically, but to also examine so that we can live our life consistently with our conviction. And very often the question is asked that sharing our belief with others is one thing, but sharing our belief in a context where there are different worldviews, different belief system is another thing, especially when that context actually has different religious belief and ideologies. That becomes a challenge. So today, in order for us to look at this question and a few others, we have a very special guest, and he's Reverend Dr. Varughese John. He is currently serving as a principal of SAIACS, which is basically South Asia Institute of Advanced Christian Studies. Varughese John is an accomplished scholar. He has 2 postdocs. He is an associate with Oxford House Research and is a networking member of International Fellowship for Mission as Transformation, and has served on the Lausanne Theology Working Group and is currently part of its core group working on integral mission. He is also a contributor to the Lausanne Orthodox Initiative. In addition to his 2012 book, Truth and Subjectivity, Faith and History, he has authored several articles in the academic journals and edited several volumes as well. His latest book, titled Indian Secularism and Religious Freedom, Mapping the Cross Pressures, is published by Oxford University Press, Oxford. Reverend Dr. Varughese John, a warm welcome.
Thank you, Bala. It's nice to be here and engage in this conversation.
First of all, looking at this subject, I know you've written on this subject widely. You've also spoken on this. First of all, to help understand our viewers, can you help unpack this word? What is the Agora and how is it related to the calling to engage in that particular space?
Agora is that space which is understood as the public square, and in the Greek culture it was, and in their polity it was the center where people sort of gathered, people from all walks of life. So the latest ideas were debated there, and it was where the deals were made. It was a center which essentially, sort of decided the fate of the society. And today, if we were to use that term, it is not a place, like a stadium, but it is a place where ideas are engaged and ideologies debated. And so it stands for the marketplace, and it could be media houses, it could be just university settings, it could be even art forms, but whichever guild it is, where the ideas are nurtured and debated, that could become our agoras. Sometimes it's the boardroom of a company, so that becomes the agora. And so my call is here then that Christians enter these spaces precisely so that we can begin to influence the culture and society at large.
Wow, thank you. I think that is very helpful. In fact, very often I notice wherever I've traveled, I've spoken to people, there is always this tendency of splitting the sacred and secular,
Right.
And I think that is one of the hindrances that people have in not getting into the so-called agora or the public square.
Correct.
What, according to you, is something that people can understand the difference between calling and career? How can you help us understand?
It is true that this dichotomy has actually affected the church and Christian participation in the world in the manner that God really desires for us to be participating. And I often tell my own church, I'm a pastor as well. I often tell my church members that when we come together on a Sunday morning, it is the huddle before the game. The real game happens from Monday to Saturday.
Wow.
But on Sunday, we come together to encourage one another and to pray for one another. Sometimes, not all the time, will our businesses and our enterprises, our engagement in our workspaces is going well. And so here is where on Sunday morning, we come together to enable faith being in action and practice, Monday through Saturday. And so the saints on Sunday stand together with each member. So that's one way to help understand. Then your work then becomes your calling. So God it's not accidental that, I work in a particular place. God has placed me there. And so every individual, every Christian believer need to ask, why has God placed her as a doctor in a hospital, or someone else as a lawyer in a firm, or as a manager in a company? That is God's calling for them. And so to hone in that particular calling, one has to give attention to how they may even increase their competency in that area so that they can reflect God in their work as well by being competent and excellent in the work they do. I have these 3 words that are helpful for us: calling, character, and competencies. So if you were to pay attention to these 3 as a Christian, it would really help us clarify our calling and reflect Christ in our character and elevate and build our competency so that our work also reflects the faithfulness of God in the world.
Wow. I mean, that is beautifully painted in terms of helping us understand that. Now, I'm just wondering, in light of what you've shared, is there a biblical foundation for what you've just outlined for us? Can you just help us look into that?
I think this sort of becomes a framework for us to sort of think about what is it that God is doing with us. And so if we are to think of our calling to start with, our calling ought to be primarily defined in relationship with God. Our calling, as Os Guinness would say, is not to some place or to something. It is always to someone, which is God. And so we are called unto God. And so, and we are to stand before the audience of one at the end of the day of reckoning. It's even on a daily basis. At the end of the day, I am accountable to what God has entrusted to me, even whether it's workplace, whether it is my family as a husband or as a father, or as a son to my parents, or in my college as a principal of SAIACS. The question is, these are things that are entrusted in my care as a steward. And so the calling comes from God. And my identity is not in these things, but it is in relationship with God, primarily, first and foremost. And if I have my identity grounded in God, then it becomes easy for me to engage in these stewarding relationships that have been entrusted in my care, so that I am still accountable to God. Otherwise, most of the people end up defining their own life and their identity almost formed by the work that they do. And that is not what God is really calling us. That's a calling in a secondary sense, but our primary calling is unto God Himself. And so, calling, character, and competency is a framework that we can use, and you can take in any chapter of the Scripture or any example that illustrates for us from the Scripture that we can better understand our own place in the world and place in the context of what God has entrusted to us within this framework.
Wow, 3 C's: calling, character, and competence. And I think when you put it that way, I think there are many examples from the Bible that we can pick up. We can think of Daniel, we can think of many others who have really,
Absolutely.
exemplified in their life.
Yeah.
Now, I'm just wondering if you can help us, I would say, if you can help us with describing or painting the model for professional engagement using the Bible.
Yeah, I mean, there are many different examples that we have. I mean, you quoted Daniel, how Daniel was ready. I mean, and he was taken as a young man and into exile, and how he recognized that where he was not necessarily outside the plan of God, and therefore he was still able to stand his ground in terms of what the kind of food he ate and the kind of behavior he showed. Likewise, if we look at Joseph, for instance, we see that Joseph, after the encounter with the Potiphar's wife, he was put in prison. And many Christians today, if something like that happened, would sulk and say, well, look at what has happened. I have been faithful to God, and look what happened to me. But look at what Joseph does. Joseph is proactively engaging in the prison. Now, this is no ordinary prison. This is the prison where some very key people are sent, particularly people from the palace are there. And we don't know how long Joseph lasted in that prison. Some accounts say for maybe 2 years. Some people even say maybe 12 years. We don't know how long Joseph lasted there. But he is not embittered and sulking and sitting in a corner wondering what exactly has happened. But he's studying, he's engaging, he's learning. He's learning from people who have come from the palace there. And so if you look at it from another angle, God is preparing Joseph with information from the palace before he gets there. And so he knows the inside outworking, insider details in the prison before he gets there. And so this is what happens if Christians were to think, even when bad things happen to us, ask the question without being bitter about it, ask the question, what does God want me to do here? And proactively engage in the situation. God will elevate you. And so this is where, if your identity primarily comes from God, then your circumstance doesn't define it for you. And so that was the key to Joseph's understanding, that prison was not the end game for him, but he was in fact put in charge of the prison by the prison guard himself while he was there. And that was due to his action. And so this is a good example for us, which illustrates how Christians can behave in the public square.
Wow. I mean, I like the way that you've rooted and you have anchored the idea of identity that is rooted in relationship and not on the work that you are called to do. And that is how you are bringing this understanding of informing your presence and your role in the marketplace, or the Agora as you have brought it. One last question that I would like to put before you is the question that when you really look at many who find themselves in that, how important is it that we build that, how do we raise that professional currency? Or in other words, how do we build a culture of excellence, which very often, sometimes you find that, it's really a bad witnessing, so to say, by the work that we do. So how important is it, if you can just help us understand and how to do it?
Yeah. I think, again, going back to the calling, character, and competency, it's interesting for us to recognize that calling comes first. God usually doesn't call according to our competency. But if we listen to him and follow what his calling, then he is the one who enables us. So there is the saying, his calling is also his enabling. You see? So when I respond to God's call, then God is the one who gives me the ability. And so we have Paul saying in his letter to the 1 Corinthians, it says, not many of you were of noble birth. But you see, this is a God who specializes in taking the weak to shame the strong. And God specializes in taking the foolish to shame the wise. And that is my story. that is the story of every Christian believer. And so if we just decide that we respond to God's calling in our lives, then his enabling will follow. And what we are required to do is pay attention to our calling and our character and be faithful to God. And God is the one who gives us the competency to do beyond my own natural capabilities. And so if you were to ask, anybody who's doing anything important or significant, they'd have the story that God is using them beyond what they are naturally capable of. And that is the testimony of every Christian believer. And so being available to God in terms of clarifying our calling, in terms of imitating Christ in our character, is precisely what naturally enables God to work our competencies for the praise of his glory. At the end of the day, all of this is for the praise of God's glory.
Wow, thank you. I mean, I really like what you have described. And when you think of it, there is no calling without a caller. And it is the caller who enables us and equips us. And as a result of that, our competency is an enable thing by God and from God. And so it's these are valuable thoughts, and I'm afraid that we don't have time, and we've come towards the end of this podcast. And thank you, Reverend Dr. Varughese John, for those valuable insights. If you have enjoyed and like this conversation, please do not forget to subscribe to our channel, and please do like this podcast. And also, please do not forget to share it with those who are on a journey of faith, reason, and discovery. And if you want to know more content or event and any other information that would help strengthen your faith in God, please do visit our website, rtbapac.in. And until our next time, stay curious and keep seeking the truth.